welcome back to another episode of Psilocybin Says. I'm Courtney Rose.
And I forgot who I am, but I'm here. I'm here with you.
Okay, I'll remind you. You're
right.
Eric.
Oh,
You're Eric
that's
Osborne.
Right. That's right. Remember that episode about too many mushrooms? Just kidding.
Right.
You're getting ready to listen to an incredible interview, I believe, with the wonderful Susan Gunner, who is the host of Psychedelic Conversations podcast and the founder of Reset Microdosing over in the UK. She's also a licensed psychotherapist. She has some really interesting perspectives on psychedelics. I particularly appreciate her thoughts around harm reduction and integration. Courtney didn't get to be a part of this interview.
Yeah, I was pretty bummed I didn't get to speak with Susan. She sounds like a really awesome person who's doing a lot of great work, but I'm excited to listen to the episode later.
And the good thing is she wants to have you on her podcast.
Woo,
so
woo.
There's that. I was also on her show as well. If you want to go check that out, Psychedelic Conversations. Talked about some, weird stuff. Imagine that. And but it was a really good conversation. Flowed really well. She's a great conversationalist, and she's got some excellent interviewees on her show. I think she's up in the 70s number of episodes. So go check it out. Subscribe to our show. Subscribe to her show. Subscribe to all the psychedelic shows.
Well, not all of them.
There's
Come on.
probably some
They're not all for everybody. But
Yeah.
if you want to find Susan's show, we're going to link it in the show notes. Everything about Susan you will find down below. So if you're not watching this on YouTube, you can see Eric and Susan's facial expressions, dynamic movements on YouTube. And if you're watching there, please do comment and let us know what you think of the episode.
Thanks as always for listening, and we'll see you on the other side of the mushroom.
Yeah, enjoy.
All right, Susan, welcome to Psilocybin Says.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, I really enjoyed our conversation on your show. I encourage all of our listeners to go check that out. And I'm eager to hear about your experiences, particularly with these conversations. I went through your library of interviewees, and you've really interviewed a lot of really interesting people. So I am grateful to be amongst the ranks.
Thank you so much for joining me as well. I think it was one of the most enjoyable and free-flowing conversation because I'm keen to interview a lot of people that are in the field, hands-on, communing with these medicines and working and guiding people. So I found that more interesting than the any other model. So that's kind of where my passion is, and that's why I love when people come in from a background of a lot of experience in the field.
Mm-hmm,
so.
What kind of inspired you to start the podcast? Just a general interest, or was there some spark that set it off?
Yeah, of course. So when I did my foundational medicine work 8 years ago now, I remember collaborating with a native medicine carrier, and I quickly started observing how different the approach to the medicine they had, and that kind of sparked my interest. How each culture and there's so many ways of approaching the medicine, and I realized there's more than one way to work with the medicine, and I thought that would be a great starting point of talking to as many people as possible who are in the field, who have their own experience and their own unique approaches, to just give the world a different view. Because there is as you know, mainstream has kind of quite a few models that are being pushed into the mainstream, but that's just scratching the surface. There's so much, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And that was kind of the inspiration I wanted to bring to the world, if they feel resonated, and if they can just listen, and it's just a different perspective from different people. So that's how it all started.
I love that. There's such a need for varied perspectives. And one of the things I was really curious about as I was going through that list and listening to some of your episodes is talking with leaders from so many different approaches. Is there any kind of consistent message, or what is the common thread maybe that you're finding through these conversations, if any?
Yeah, there is one actually that's kind of developing. One is which that most people who have a field experience for many, many years, they realize very quickly that psychedelic work can't be put in a small container like the scientific model. So that's been the developing thread. And people who really understand what we're dealing with, they have a very different approach and understanding. Mm-hmm. So kind of contradicts what the mainstream media is feeding the public right now. Mm-hmm. So that's the thread that really, highlighted for me again and again, especially from those guests that are actually traveled to the ends of the world to sit with the indigenous people, to sit with those real medicine keepers and gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. So that was really interesting. So now it makes me think, how do we bring this into a room all desensitized and confined? And so that's kind of like the interesting part for me.
And how do we do that? I mean, I just got off the phone with a clinician, and, finding out how limited their ability is to speak and share their information, because so much of this is still in the research and development phase. It feels like we're limited in our ability to integrate our knowing as practitioners with this more modern medical perspective. So do you see inroads there, or what does that look like? So
coming from the therapy background myself, so my approach has always been not so much the traditional, not so much the clinical setting of, being in a clinical room of, mm-hmm. eye shades and there's someone sitting by the patient. Not like that. I already had this is going to, it is set up to fail from the start. Only because the way that I approach it, for example, I look at the psilocybin as a psychedelic medicine as a revealing experience. So what does that look like? I mean, if the clinician or the person facilitating this experience, if they don't understand it, mm-hmm. Since the psychedelic entheogens, let's say, they communicate to us in very symbolic and metaphorical ways. Mm-hmm. So, and it cannot be translated or interpreted in that direct, literal way. So if you look at the indigenous shamans or the indigenous medicine facilitators, they understand these symbolic and metaphorical messaging or communication, and they have a different way of bringing it to the person who's experiencing them. In some ways, they also keep them accountable. So, because of the born into the family lineage, and they've been watched by their elders, and there is an accountability where people kind of stay in line. Ideally, not all the time, but I mean, mm-hmm. we hear horror stories of that. But ideally, that's kind of the model that has kept this going really well. And if we can bring this into the therapeutic model, which means we're going to need a therapist or a facilitator who understands the language of the medicine, mm-hmm. and then help translate or interpret it for the patient or the client or the participant in a way that they can integrate and understand. Because if there is no understanding and these big metaphorical, biblical experiences left unintegrated, can become the biggest despair and disorientation. So, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, the way to get a deeper understanding of how psychedelics work is to read more books and more research papers.
Right.
I'm being facetious, obviously. It's the experience, right? And I think
it's the experience, yeah.
Which is, God, it's amazing to me how much pushback I have gotten in medical and therapeutic communities, and I see this not just with myself, I see these conversations in LinkedIn, which is where we connected, and other platforms where when it's presented that a practitioner should have many years of experience before they're administering to the public and whatnot, there's a lot of pushback against that. And what do you think is behind that? And just real quick to say before we go on, obviously Courtney couldn't join us today because a lot of work that she had to do, but I'm going to be drinking one of her incredible smoothies while we talk here. So don't take offense. And she is with us in a way. So, but yeah, what's the pushback? What's the origin of that pushback?
Enjoy the smoothie, by the way. And sending love to Courtney. Hope to have her on the Psychedelic Conversations.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very eager for you all to meet. I think you would get on fabulously. So
amazing. So the pushback, probably because we don't have time. Probably because there's a real panic around the time of how to bring this as quick as possible. Just because, as you know, with the pandemic and all kinds of different things are happening in the world, kind of like bringing up a lot of trauma in people, inducing a lot of anxiety. I mean, as you know, these symptoms are not something that just born out of the pandemic, because it's like our world has changed. We're living in a post-pandemic era, which is very different than pre-pandemic. So I think we need a lot more elders, people like wisdom carriers can speak to this more often. People need guidance in these kind of transitions, which we don't have. In the Western model, we don't have these elders, the people that you go to for to consult them or to how they share wisdom and guide people. Like if you look at the tribal human wiring, there's always these elders, leaders, some people ushering them into these uncertainty and some of these conflicting transitional times, right? So unfortunately in the West we don't have this. People are very alone, they don't have connections, they're suffering alone in their homes, so the suicide rate is going up by the minute. Anxiety is like off the charts, and just to say that this is not because it's happened during the pandemic, it was already there. Yes. This is a process of bringing up a lot of trauma that people carried, suppressed, were able to function before, and now somehow some of the things have shifted and changed so fast. Anytime we hit such incredible uncertain times, the system gets all shaken and everything is now coming to surface. And so the timing, the sensitivity around that is the big issue. And that's why the medicines are being ushered fast. Like we can't get them out fast enough. So there is that urgency. And I understand that. For example, Rick Doblin talks to this a lot, and he says, we don't have time. Like we don't have time. I get that. There is an urgency and a need for help. There is, and it's coming from all very good intentions. But when we're dealing with entheogens, it doesn't follow those kind of rules. It doesn't. And I've spoken to many people from the jungle who took the pilgrimage to jungle and sat with different tribes and wisdom carriers. And before they were allowed to drink their first ayahuasca, for example, or yahe, or any, whatever the name that the tribes or indigenous people call them, they had to go through so many different rites of passages before they were brought to the first experience with the medicine. So they kind of taken through lots of rites of passages, meaning they were challenged biologically, physically, psychologically, by maybe with fasting, maybe with resetting their gut biome through different diets of different plants that are non-psychoactive. Meditation, for example, can you sit with yourself, contain yourself in a challenging situation, for example? So they were kind of led into by the elders of the medicine, carriers for so many months and years before finally it was agreed for them to take their first ayahuasca. So that's a very different approach. And there's a reason why, because when such, ineffable experiences just kind of found you, if you cannot contain yourself in this body, then you're going to want someone to, like, you're going to cause havoc. You're going to want someone to maybe pin you down, not exactly, but do you know what I mean? Hold your hand, or, I mean, we've seen this happen. We've seen this happen in the retreats that I took part in, and we've seen people running around in all kinds of ways, and because the logic goes out the window, everybody turns into this Ken Wilber says, what's the word he uses? It's almost like they become infants, they become these toddlers running around, right? So, but a trained body, a trained nervous system then will be able to contain the vastness and the hugeness of this experience. So that's the initial training. So how do we help people build that, that such capacity then to contain themselves? I'm not saying contain the experience, contain themselves during the experience. So there's a fine line there, and a lot of the facilitators don't understand this, Yeah.
God, that is yes. It goes back to, for me, there's so much here that I'd like to unpack, and I think that it's people see individuals like us and don't understand the history that we have with the medicine. And it's very easy to think, well, there's that person doing it, so I can do it too. But they don't know the thousands of hours that have been spent in learning to contain your system like that. And that's why when I am, we're training people probably at a faster pace than, we would like, obviously, but because that need is so high and individual healing is so high. And one of the things that we're really working to do first and foremost is to train people to sit with themselves. And why the most important rule, I've often joked that my only rule is don't leave. Because as time has gone on and I've found myself in these terrifying situations where I'm tempted to drive myself to the hospital or run screaming into the night, that knowledge that if we just stay there, if we stay put, if we just dig in and get through this thing, that we're going to come out so much better afterwards. But, like you said, training that nervous system, when you are faced with imminent death, we're not accustomed to running into it, to facing it. We try to run the other way. And so it takes such a long time and so many experiences to be able to, train that into yourself. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is the kind of wisdom needs to be out to the public. The Western model or the life in the West, as you know, people have been I talk about the rescue culture, for example. The rescue culture, we became a rescue culture. It's like we don't allow people anymore to go through their challenges.
Oh, so true.
Right? There are so many technicians, physicians, doctors, all kinds of people, psychotherapists, just end of the phone, and somehow people just cannot be with their challenging states, and it's almost like continued outsourcing to a friend, to a doctor, to a therapist, to someone, to something. Just get me out of this state. Let me go to a drum bath. Let me go to a sound bath. Let me go to this, all kinds of circles, healing circles. Anything but just to be with this. I can't. So I will just spend all of my energy doing all kinds of things, but to be with it. So there is a real need to train the mind, or the mindset of the modern lifestyle that we've accustomed to thinking that we can just take 2 pills and get rid of the headache.
Right. And that's how we're seeing psychedelics still being presented. And if there is one kind of risk to public safety around psychedelics, I feel like it is treating them as a panacea or as a typical Western medicine that you have, you take the medicine and then you have this result, when, as you obviously know, it's years unfolding. A single experience is years in the unfolding.
Yes.
Can you talk about some of your personal experience though? What is psilocybin? Is ayahuasca? What is your medicine of choice, so to speak?
Yeah. So there is a saying, I don't know if you know, Eric, there is a saying that the deeper the wounds, the tougher the medicine you go for. Like when I interview, for example, facilitators of, for example, 5-MeO, Bufo, Alveri, so I'm like, wow, like what story do you carry in order to facilitate? As you know, the 5-MeO Bufo is known to be the most powerful of all. Mm-hmm. So there is this curiosity always sparks in me. What took you to come, let alone work with Bufo, but to facilitate is a whole nother level. It's a little bit like that, my story. So my medicine of choice in the beginning was ayahuasca. So I did work with ayahuasca for a very long time. And then San Pedro, then mushroom. So it's kind of like, how also, which I don't agree, people say, oh, you should always go with mushrooms first before you do the ayahuasca. There is this they kind of put all these medicine hierarchical levels. I don't know if you agree or not, but in my personal experience, there is no such a thing. Right. All medicines can be very powerful in its own. It is not so much the medicine, but it's the container that the medicine is interacting with, container being us, the body, the person, depending where we are and how much work we have done and what capacity, the nervous system capacity we have, psychological capacity, and all of these, put in perspective, the medicine will interact with you at that level. So we can't be saying start with mushrooms because they're gentle. Not really, because I had my most intense experience with mushrooms. So, if anything. So, my choice of medicine was ayahuasca. And at the time I was training as a psychologist and a therapist as well. And luckily I had a lot of information around the somatic therapy, working with the body and the meditation practices, the mindfulness. I was trying to find like a bridge between how this one informed the other. How do we bring this together? Around that time, I discovered Peter Levine, the somatic experiencing founder, and I realized how the trauma and the wounding was stuck in the body and carried in the body. Not exactly the wounding, but the memories, how the body responded in the moment of that trauma was carried on a cellular level in the body. And it was really obvious for me in my ayahuasca experience that I was brought back there again and again and again physically. So that understanding changed everything for me. And that's where I started, my God, if we can just help people to get to a really good place in their system. For example, if someone is suffering from anxiety, PTSD, complex PTSD, for example, they cannot contain themselves in a body. They are not there in the first place. So if we can just understand these nuances when people come to medicine in the screening process, and you'll know that you're dealing with a hypersensitive person and that they are not going to be able to contain themselves when they are brought back to the memories of the initial trauma. So that trauma-informed perspective changes from the experience itself, how a person receives it, and the whole integration sessions after. The whole thing changes with that understanding alone. So that's how I kind of did my own work alongside learning and making sense of it, bringing all kinds of therapy models, also the indigenous wisdom. How can we, put a bridge? For example, one of my favorite stories I tell with our community is how the native medicine carrier that I worked with, she was like, she would say, she would use a language, for example, exorcism. Mm-hmm. So she would say, like, during a ceremony, she would say, oh, we're going to exorcise this entity that you're carrying inside. For me, that was, oh, wow, she means this person is carrying a very deep wounding and trauma. Mm. And that's what they are sensing. And that's the language they're using. But it was very quickly revealed to me that someone who comes from the Western model of living the life, and they have no idea of these kind of understanding and perspective of the natives, and that could freak someone out. Mm-hmm. If you go up to somebody who's never done the medicine and they have a very shaky religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs, for example, the entity, the otherworldly stuff, for example, and the facilitator goes up to them and says, we're going to exorcise you tonight. We're going to get that entity out of you. And that could in itself freak the person out. Mm-hmm. And that session can become their biggest, nightmare for months. So,
right, so re-traumatizing.
Exactly. So there is a whole lot of nuanced details around how to approach these big, ineffable experiences, in what model, in what sense, and can we bring the Western, the language, the Indigenous, and the spiritual, can we merge them? Can we create bridges? Can we bring it to people in a way that individually they can be kind of customized for them in their own understanding and the level they are? And this is going to take an incredible work, Eric. This is not this is not something we could just prepare someone for like 4 weeks before. Do you know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Like it's going to take a facilitator that really knows their ground and understands the different languages, the perspectives, world views, cultures. Like, for example, people of color, people nations that come from a really deep oppression, history of oppression, for example. Your approach has to be very different to them. Mm-hmm. They cannot be put in the same circle as another person who is just coming in there for different needs and intents, which again they can, but it's going to require that level of a experienced facilitator to contain all at once. So there's lots of different nuances and details in this. Yeah.
So true. So true. That the language barriers seem to be one of the most challenging as we're particularly working with diverse demographics, because every individual is an individual worldview and has their own lexicon and linguistic system that they use to describe the world that they're in. And so to be able to adapt is one of another really important skill in a facilitator, from person to person, and experiencing in the group circles, one of the most enjoyable and challenging aspects is that, one period you're sitting there with an individual who is going through their process and their personal history and their worldview, and also their immediate expression that they're in. And then you may be called to go to someone else immediately who is in a completely different place. And as a facilitator, you have to be able to effectively shift from moment to moment. And then to be able to kind of recover yourself and integrate that experience yourself. I think we're going to see a real need for integration support therapy, if you want to call it that, for practitioners as they get more and more exposed to this, energy flying all over the place, or secondary trauma, So in your work as a facilitator, and I know, well, hold on, I want to put a pin in that because I don't want to get too far off of your personal experiences. Let's move into psilocybin. You said ayahuasca is where you started, but you also said that psilocybin was one of your most challenging experiences. And this has always been, I feel like something that is not well understood, even within the psychedelic community, let's say, that psilocybin is not necessarily gentle and ayahuasca is not necessarily always hard either. So to try to box this stuff in is just really ineffective. So maybe if you could draw on some of your psilocybin experiences as a basis of comparison for us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, actually. Yeah, and just want to highlight that again and again. Even with doses, for example, I get a lot of questions about what would you call a high dose, or what is the average high dose? I'm like, but it's not dose dependent.
Right.
This is my answer. And they're like, what do you mean? But I read so-and-so paper said 3 grams or 5. I'm like, because I've seen someone really having this full-blown psychosis on just 1.5.
Yep.
And then I've seen others not even feeling anything at 5. So we can't box them up. So for sure, and ayahuasca isn't necessarily tough, and isn't necessarily female, and San Pedro isn't necessarily male.
Right.
It's interesting, right? It's just insane to me how we try to sense make of all this, but we're just making it right. And then we make more mess of it, right?
Yeah.
So the mushroom experience, the challenging experience, it revealed to me how fragile my psychological well-being was. And it did this through taking me to the edges of my psyche. It's almost like to a point where I was holding on to my dear life on a thread. And that is a revealing experience. So if I didn't understand, so that's the education part. Like, we need to speak more of this, that these medicines are revealing, rather not something external coming in, but it's like internal being revealed, highlighted.
Yes.
So in that experience, I could easily say lots of different things to distract myself and say, there's also stories like, there was, because of this so-and-so person, they brought in some entity so that we all now, the whole ceremony is messed up. But no, it was more like a very grounded understanding of, wow, it's literally doing this almost purposely to show me how fragile my psychology is. At that time, that was like the biggest breakthrough I had, but it came with a very strong, like it demanded, to contain myself in that way that I did, that allowed me to have the breakthrough. So I could have easily created a whole chaos and ask the facilitator to come and hold my hand, or distract myself from that thing that the medicine was trying to show me. Make it about the person over there, or the facilitator. Like, I get these stories as well. Sometimes when people have a challenging experience, they say, the facilitator wasn't experienced enough, so the container wasn't held safe enough.
Right.
So therefore, there's these energies are flying around. I'm like, hang on a minute. Have you ever thought that maybe you just can't contain yourself because it was so challenging? How about just accepting that it was really challenging for you? It's okay. It's okay to be vulnerable about that. So that was my experience of the realization how fragile my psychology, and that also, psychedelics, they don't heal us in a sense, but they just show us where to start, right? Where to start. So that was this is where I start.
God, I feel like you and I could have lots of conversations. My general sense is that you are one of the most experienced facilitators that I have spoken with. Yeah, no, it's an energy, and it's a wisdom that's present in your knowing that we don't know, and so that's where I found myself in recent years, a challenge when people ask me these questions that they're like, the answer is always just kind of like, and we want answers. We want to know, like, what's going to happen when I do this. And there's just no way to tell. And you just have to dive in yourself and keep going back at it, because it will be as different as many times as you approach it, as different as it will be. But what in terms of your spiritual understanding? So you've spoken quite a bit about the psychological perspective, which I appreciate, and that obviously is an important lens to bring into all of this. But also, the more esoteric, or that which we maybe don't have as effective language for. Like, how do you understand and engage and communicate that side of this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Probably this is the first time I'll be speaking to it, because somehow I've been very private with that side of my life, the spiritual side, because I always had this inkling that the spiritual side is a very intimate, it's that private connection, and it's almost like very unique, that is hard to explain, to put the words into that. For that reason, I always try and avoid going to the spiritual direction. And also because I don't agree with the spiritualization of the psychedelic medicines as well. I don't like the way it's heading.
Okay.
For example, the one that sticks out the most is the love and light culture, right?
Yeah.
It's all about the healing and we're all one, but then
the sound baths and the drum circles.
Yeah, but obviously we're not, because, so for me, to be honest, Eric, the spiritual aspect for me, paradoxically, has always been about, can I be a good person in my life? Can I become a shelter, a container, a safe home for those that I love? That's spirituality for me. Can I be a good person for the planet, for the communities? Can I be super conscious of what I say, what I do, my actions? That's a really hard work, being conscious of all this all the time. It's exhausting. And I tie the spirituality to the mundane, which is really different than the esoteric understanding of the other realms or the dimensions. I mean, Stan Groff is one of the guys that I really digged into his spiritual emergency books and some of his, textbooks and some of these concepts that he shares. And I know that he brings a lot of like a metaphorical, symbolic, like all kinds of different conversations to table. But somehow for me, it's always about, there is this anchor that I use. A friend of mine told me this a while ago during my early work of medicines. And he said, he's a philosopher, by the way, and he said, there was a nun who retired after 40 years of serving in a monastery as a nun. And they wanted to interview this lady and ask, the questions were like, so, what did you do in your 40 years of like service? Did you commune with angels? Did you speak to God? And all these kind of questions. And she paused and paused for a long time. And she said, I learned two things: how to eat and how to sleep. Was very different than what they expected. So it's kind of like my spiritual understanding ties into integrating myself in the mundane more so than away, like more grounding rather than ascending, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. Excuse me. Excuse me. No, absolutely. Yesterday I did a lot of yard work, and it is always so profound to me how spiritual digging dirt is. It is one of the most spiritual things. And I've said, even as a mushroom grower, ultimately I'm a dirt maker. That's what we're doing. I just want to make good dirt, and I want my body to be good dirt. So yes, that grounding, which is what I think makes for a really good facilitator as well, right? Because when all the balloons are out floating in the ether, somebody's got to be there holding it all to the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to tell you one example. For example, it's easy to spiritualize all the experiences of the entheogenic medicines, right? Rightly so, because not denying that piece, but I feel like what's been perpetuated in those circles is quite dangerous right now. It's like one of my online mentors, for example, Caroline Mace. She's like a spiritual mentor, and she's been at this for like 40 years. For example, she's really against this quick access to the esoteric, the spiritual. She talks about, like, she gives examples of how in the past, for example, you would need a mentor, somebody who's already been through the path. And then you would, go to places, and initially you would cook and clean, sweep the floor before you're allowed to ask the question, who am I? For example. Somehow, because of the quick access to the medicines right now, again, coming back to the container, if this container isn't ready, accessing to an experience, metaphorically, communing with the God is quite dangerous, actually. As a wisdom, it's too quick, too soon, they can't digest it, and that then fuels the ego instead. Instead of humbling the person, instead of bringing them and grounding them, it's actually, like you said, blowing them up more, and there's more, like, then this desire of ascending more, like, let's all ascend and leave. What about our bodies? What about here? What about the 3D? Where are we going? We haven't even learned how to root. We haven't even learned how to ground and root and claim our space on planet Earth. We haven't even done that yet. We're just such in infancy. Where are we going? We can't go now. So that's like a premature wisdom that's been perpetuated in psychedelic medicine circles. Is actually quite dangerous. You've seen it probably. That just feeds more of the ego desires of wanting to be something, anything but this ordinary human, like anything extraordinary but this ordinary human. There is this incredible denial, wanting to be just an ordinary, simple person. And what you said about their digging dirt is accepting that. That's for me is what spiritual is. Yeah.
So do you think it's that to say that psychedelics are always ego dissolving, is that untrue?
Of course.
That's the other part of this that just drives me crazy, is like this rhetoric of, I take mushrooms to dissolve my ego, and then it just becomes a pissing contest of who took more mushrooms or who's more spiritually evolved, Yeah. So how do we communicate this? What do we do when we live in a culture that is so focused on what's over there, right? How do we help people to understand? And these experiences, because they are so expansive and they do help so many people. But how do we help people kind of keep it grounded and understand that this is just a step in the process to just keep coming back to center within the psychedelic community?
Yeah. So that's the for me, that's the community. So integration is the community. I believe in that so much. So in itself, the community, having in your community, for example, I think the way the psychedelic kind of wants us to come back to that community model is so evident in everything.
Yes.
So what does that mean for those that are listening, not really understanding the context here is, in that community, you would have people who's walked the path before you. And then there'll be newcomers. And then, there's different, not in a hierarchical, not that. I'm not talking about that. It's more of a family together. It's just that some people will have more wisdom, more experience, more hours with the medicine. Therefore, they can then say, hey, like you said, the accountability. Hey, after your first session with ayahuasca, please don't tell me that medicine told you to serve ayahuasca tomorrow. like somebody needs to tell them.
Yeah.
Like somebody, and we need, and who can do that? If we are a rescue culture, if we are too afraid of rejection, if, let's say, most of us in the medicine work haven't done our own work, and we still thrive on how the participants come to us, if we still are on this level where we want everyone to like us, that's the disservice. So I always say we need sharp-tongued mentors who can keep the accountability in check, tell them as it is. Yes, you may be a good facilitator capacity. You might have it, or you might be that special person, but wait. There are other steps before we get there. So we need those kind of community members to keep those people accountable. And facilitators as well. Like you know this, there's lots of people carrying before medicine in their pockets and they're just giving it out as if it's like, nothing. And so I don't know how we're going to tackle this issue. This is a really, really sensitive, again, conversation around how do we do this? Do we create like a group of counsel where people are watching, who's watching who, for example?
Oh, yeah. And that creates such a slippery slope as well, because you have to ensure that those individuals are not of a hierarchical mind because, even as you say this, more experienced facilitators, people want to rank. And it's very difficult when that is our format for, our basis of comparison for almost everything is who's above and who's below. And to be able to bring this work on an equal playing field and help people understand that even the most experienced practitioner still has an enormous amount to learn. And it's much easier in the earlier stages to mistakenly feel that you have gained some authority and wisdom because of these initial experiences. And if you continue to work with the medicine as it progresses, then it's more likely that ego will be put in check and you can understand that you don't understand and then be a more effective facilitator, helping each other hold accountable. I really appreciate what you said about that, the sharp tongue, because we are so used to walking on eggshells and, treating everybody like broken individuals. And it doesn't mean because we are stern or because we have, or we're very direct in our speech, particularly around something that there's a great risk with psychedelics just because it's not toxic in any way. Just because psilocybin is physiologically very safe doesn't mean that there aren't significant risks associated with it. And fortunately myself, I don't know what it is. I hope, or I feel that it is the medicine itself that has guided me, because I haven't had elders and I have certainly slipped along the way, and my ego has certainly blown out of proportion along the way, and it's had to be continually put in check by the community and by the medicine itself. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting kind of unfolding in the culture that we're in around this.
Yeah, it is.
So what about, you've mentioned kind of
maybe not real directly, but I've heard you say a couple of times now, and the intelligence of the medicine, or the wisdom of the medicine, the intention of the medicine. What are your thoughts on how we are perceived, or how we are engaged with on the side of the sacraments or the medicine themselves?
Yeah. So I don't know if you heard this sentence that the medicines are cultivating us. Mm-hmm. In a way, there is an inside joke among my other facilitator friends that we've been sort of like hired by the medicines to bring it to the world because, they can't do it themselves, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. As I understand from your question, how one of the things that, again and again comes to mind for me specifically, the entheogens, somehow they carry an agenda. Agenda meaning not an insidious agenda. It's actually a very open agenda where they just want to put things right. Mm. They just want to put things right. And the way they engage with us is exactly in that sort of approach. They just want things to be just like, hey, there is this consciousness thing is going. It's like an energy, something. It's like a mothership or something is happening, and you are part of this. And let's kind of file down your arrogance a little bit, so that there is something bigger than you, and the world doesn't revolve around you. So let's bring you home in that sense. Like, let's bring you home. It's almost like the entheogens for me are, let's bring you home. That's kind of the message I always hear. And this is it's now evident in so many experiences and witnessing. I think that's how they want to interact with us. Like, let's bring everyone home and let's stop this thing that's causing the unnecessary conflict in all of us.
Mm-hmm. So how do we find this balance, or where is the balance in this kind of what the medicines want, so to speak, and our own eagerness to satisfy that human ego and to be, psychedelic practitioners and all of that? Like, where is there a place where that comes together? Do you understand what I'm saying? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Also, can I be honest with you in a sense that for someone to come into this work in the way that we do, you got to have some really messed up background. Mm. Like you got to have this which is the messed up background, meaning like a life, or upbringing in such a violent environment or hostile environment where, growing up, all of these values and virtues are just being ripped away. And a lot of the people that come to the medicine work, usually they don't know it at the time, but they realize after, if guided well, that, oh my God, I didn't have a home to start with. Mm. So, but then as the work evolves and unfolds and the person kind of gets stronger in themselves and their understanding and their expansiveness and all of that, there is a switching point. There's a switch that happens within them. And in that switch, all of the hostile upbringing and the volatile experiences and the trauma and the wounding suddenly becomes their greatest gift. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they can contain such work. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the facilitators, when they do their internal work well, mm-hmm. they are going to be the one that lasting and holding these circles till the end. Mm-hmm. Because they can contain so much chaos, because they can be with so much difficulty. It's almost like as this thing is unfolding, the psychedelic renaissance and things are happening, at the end, those are the facilitators going to stand there still, not crumbling. Because just because they made that switch where they now turned all of that struggle, the challenge, into a gift of containing all of that chaos. For example, like my upbringing, from a very infancy, early age, I was in the care of a grandmother who suffered from complex PTSD and all host of other mental issues that is unknown because it was a taboo and a stigma back then. And so I was trained by her unintentionally. So all of that chaos that I had to contain as a kid, it's the same scene in a psychedelic ceremony. All that chaos that you can contain. It's almost like I know this place. I navigate this place really well. So that's kind of my understanding that those are the facilitators are going to stand through this challenging time. And really, again, like I said, a lot of people won't do this otherwise, like who does this, right? It's crazy. It's crazy to think like the level of intensity that you ask to be with. That it could push you to the ends of your psyche, that it's hard to contain all of that. And then you question yourself, like, why am I doing this every single time? So that's kind of like an indication of for me, that's a green light. If someone's continually questioning themselves every time, that's healthy. So the red flag for me would be a facilitator who's so full of themselves and can come in there and that's kind of like a red flag for me. So there's lots of different, again, threads that I'm opening, but I think you understand what I mean.
I totally. And I think that is in a kind of a roundabout way comes to this question of the intersect of, the intention of the medicine and kind of the ego that that is being brought into the conversation around psychedelics, is that eventually we will see that those among us who are the most wounded are the greatest healers. And we have this tendency to kind of glamorize the medical world, the person who can come in and, like you say, rescue, save the day with their instruments and their tools, when it is our own fortitude that is really the tool that we have to bring into the situation. And it quite honestly brings me to tears thinking about, so many people who have come, they come to you, I'm sure as well, feeling damaged, feeling worthless, feeling like they're completely incapable of even supporting themselves. And through patience and practice with these medicines, find out that they are not only capable of and have been supporting themselves, but they're capable of so much more.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
And that switch is the key here, because somehow before the switch, when I say the switch, the unaware, like when we are wounded and unaware, that can be really toxic. But then aware and wounded and acceptance of that it's what is all about, and that changes everything. And for example, the whole new age trauma-informed spirituality is really toxic, because like you said, we are perpetuating that these wounded people walking around, it's almost like giving them the card to say, yeah, you're broken, so stay in that victim mind. Like there's a perpetuation going on. And then these souls, they attend to, there is a trend now that we have, again, another inside joke, like it's almost there's a competition in ceremonies. Who can suffer the most? Like, because almost there's a reward or a trophy at the end, like, give me my badge. I can do the suffering. Like,
Right.
I've suffered the most. How can I do it even better next time? Like, that's really not this is all about.
Correct.
Yeah.
No. And I think for all of my work personally, this has been challenging to communicate because of that culture that seems to value suffering over joy. Well, let me just kind of give an example. Have you ever been in an experience where, in a group ceremony, someone is in their suffering, which, I'm not discrediting any of it. All experiences are welcome and valid, all experiences. But oftentimes, those who are in suffering mode are almost offended by someone in joyful mode, right? And it seems that we don't value joy as much as we value suffering. But just like the traumatic experiences that we go through in life are, I believe, consciousness attempting to bring us to our state of being healers, suffering is intended to bring us to joy. And I know it can be really hard to see that when you're in the midst of suffering, and there is this switch that has to flip eventually. But it's always been interesting to me how we seem to value tears over laughter, when laughter and joy is what we're actually all coming to the medicine for in the long run.
Exactly. And this is so amazing that you bring this up, because I have a story to tell about this. So in one of my ayahuasca sessions, as usual, I got ready. I was like, yes, ready. This time I will go into this underworld, slay the dragons, whatever. I'm ready. Like, this time I'm ready like no one else. Like, I'm really ready. And then an hour into the medicine, there's this almost like joyful laughter. Like, what do you mean you want to go and slay the dragons in the underworld? All that. Like, what is that about? Like, stop kidding yourself. That's your home. You live there. That's your template. That is your template. You live there. You run the dragons. You employ everyone. Right? So you're the boss of the underworld. So stop kidding yourself that this is your darkness, your shadow, that you got to go in and do some crazy suffering and slay the dragons. No, your darkness is joy, which is not in your template. Which is not in your template is your darkness. And that could be joy. That's your work. And I was like, how dare you? How dare you? How dare you? Where is my dragon? I want to slay it. Or demons. I don't know. Like, demons. I want to slay it. And yeah. Incredible insight. Because don't forget, people who are seeking out the medicine, they carry a template of how can I suffer the best? Because the template is sadness, feelings of doom, despair, anxious. Those are the lost people who somehow cannot claim their place on this planet. They cannot root, they cannot grow, they cannot ground. Those are going to come to the medicine. So that's, it's there is a theme, people that are coming into this medicine that carry the same template. That's why now it's become a competition of who can do the suffering better than all of the, circle, who's in the circle. So there is a almost like perpetuation of more of that. Instead, a sharp-tongued facilitator would come up and say, hey, stop it. This is not what we're doing. This is, we're here to eventually have that switch in our template and learn to be in joy and accept it, welcome it. It's the darkness, so it's unfamiliar. So just because, we have these concepts around the shadow, the darkness, nobody even stops to think that joy could be your darkness. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? So there needs to be circles of these conversations happening to give people that insight so that we can stop this competition, who can suffer best, right? So we need to move away from that eventually, like you said, eventually. Obviously, we welcome the suffering in the beginning because, as we said, the medicines are revealing experiences, so obviously they're going to reveal everything that's carried in their template. At first, there's steps, there's a whole process to it, there's unfolding to it. So, but at some stage, this needs to stop,
Yeah. Ayahuasca actually was the one that I feel like in many ways really helped me get over that threshold. I've always found great joy in, joy has been accessible in many mushroom trips. And I've only had 2 ayahuasca experiences, and both of them were, relatively mild. I'm pretty accustomed to purging. I purge quite a bit with mushrooms anyway, so I just embraced that. But ayahuasca showed me that I had basically been spending my life mourning the life that could have been rather than celebrating the life that was. And it was a major switch flipper for me, despite not being that powerful of an experience. And I'm curious, how have you integrated that shadow of joy into your life? Where are you in that journey? Because I'm still working to integrate that on a daily basis.
Oh yeah, this is such a great question. So around the time I had an advantage of having a really informed therapist friend. And I remember he used to keep me accountable for things like, what did you do for yourself this weekend or whatever? Like, do you ever go out for a meal just to enjoy it for the sake of it? Do you do things like outings? Like, I'm like, no, why would I? Like, no, why would I do that? And then at some point he was like, I'm going to keep you accountable and I'm going to ask you to do something joyful every week because we are repatterning your behavior. So, and I need you to tell me you've done one thing nice that you enjoyed and it was lovely. And I'm like, okay. And then a week later, like, did you do it? I'm like, I didn't have any ideas. Like, no way. Now you want me to give you ideas? I'm like, yeah, because I don't know. So do you see the level of it? It's just, it's insane. Mm-hmm. So that kind of put me on that path of, okay, this is psychology, right? You repattern the old pattern and then eventually it becomes integrated and it becomes the familiar. So that's where I am. Every day it's still a work.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. Yeah, I'm imagining, there's certainly a time in my life when someone may have tasked me with doing something that felt good and I would have responded with self-flagellation or, I tortured myself for a few hours. That was enjoyable.
Yeah.
What's your current practice look like? I think that there's still also the mistaken belief that, we're taking mushrooms or ayahuasca or San Pedro or smoking DMT every weekend. Like, how do you engage in terms of regularity with medicines?
I don't remember the last big dose that I took. So that's how long it's been. Mm-hmm. So currently, through all the work that I have done, I came to this conclusion that, more about the understanding of the container. So I call the container the body, right? The level of nervous system capacity and so on, the resiliency and all of that, the psychological resiliency and the flexibility. That's really key for me in the medicine work. Mm-hmm. So I decided that, okay, so when we bring in people who don't have this kind of understanding or the preparation in this kind of work, what happens is that when they have these big experiences, it's like blowing out so quickly, expanding, and then suddenly at that level contracting. So that's why a lot of people go to a weekend medicine ceremonies, and then they go home with in the same week, they go back to their old patterns instantly. And that's because, when you blow out your system so quick, so fast, so much, there is the reaction is to shut it back down as quick as possible. So from that understanding and the knowledge, I decided that we need to get people on these protocols of microdosing. We need to get them on understanding the microdosing, because for me, microdosing has changed and shifted a lot of things about how we need to bring these models into the Western world. Because the Indigenous people get this. They grow up in these kind of ways in which they understand the medicine. It's a thing in their lives. So they have the community, so they don't need integration. If you look at a lot of the native people use as medicine, they don't talk about integration. It's a Western thing, right? So, that in mind, I realized the microdosing over time, consistently, with guidance, with a lot of knowledge and information around this whole capacity building, really changed the game. And through those experiences, now I recommend everyone to go through these microdosing experiences, protocols, at least in their own way, in their own time, with a guide, because the microdosing, you're still taking a tiny dose of the same big spirit, the intelligence. So there are times I've seen people really going into deep trauma work with microdosing. So that's possible. So the guidance is utmost important. And then once they kind of work with several protocols, we've noticed that their system now is in a really good, robust place to go into the big experience, and there is a more lasting change because of that preparation. Just because they've shifted their understanding, they learned a lot, and they understood the whole thing about being with your difficulties and challenges and emotions. Microdosing teaches that really well in little incremental openings. It kind of dissipates quick, it comes on quick, and then it kind of leaves the person quick. So that kind of like a training ground to then go into the big ineffable experiences, then contain, that changed everything. Yeah, so that's kind of how I am structuring some of the work that I'm doing as a facilitator.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that I have a tendency to just defer back to my own experiences, which were still very gradual, even though I have, the vast majority of my work has been with moderate to high doses. I came into it very gradually. At the age of 19, I took my first dose, and then it was only like 3 grams, and then maybe 6 months later, and then 6 months after that. And it was 2009. I started dosing in 99, and it was 2009 before I did a 5-gram trip, and probably even myself in working with people have underestimated even my own experience in gradually coming to kind of different levels or different thresholds within that space.
I love that. It's very similar to the structure that I recommend. Yeah, I love that. It's like gradual building of that inner capacity. And also in the process, you learn how to be with these dynamics, right? The dimensions that you've been taken out of, like all these places that you get tested. And it's a complete learning on a theoretical way. Like you understand this territory now, and each time you do better, and each time you do better we need this. We need this. This is a lovely Western model, as opposed to the Indigenous way of usage. But so that's very lovely. Like you said, gradually building that capacity. For me, it's all about contain the person. Can they contain themselves? Without relying too much on others in their experience, because that what repatterns them and changes them. It's a bit like that shift came to me. I remember when I was practicing yoga with a teacher, with a facilitator of some time, and somehow she was so intuitive that she kept asking me or guiding me into these poses that really was challenging. But she was really intuitive in terms of like, she would say things like woo-woo things like that. Oh, I feel like your heart is so closed. So then she would ask me to do these heart opening poses, like asanas. I'm like, they were really challenging. Like she knows she was onto something. Like I knew she was onto something. So she didn't practice yoga as a fitness regimen. She really did this in a spiritual perspective. And in one of those poses, I actually fell on the ground, and this breaking to sweat and tears. And she just went, get up and go back into pose now, like immediately. And I thought that was rude. But then I understood why. Because as I did that, I was able to now, second time, do a bit longer. And then as she talked me through, the longer you can hold this pose, this challenging pose, it's going to translate into your life. Next time you face a challenging moment in your life, guess what? You're going to bounce back quicker. And I was like, oh, wow. Like that was a great insight, which we find the same in the medicine. Yeah. So that's kind of like how I bridge the two experiences. So the more challenging experiences, can you be with it? Can you gradually build your capacity? That's where the magic is, because that translates into your life, how you deal with the real life challenges. Yeah.
So the last big question I ask, and I definitely want to save more. We could talk for another hour easily, but I want to save more for further conversations. But I'm curious, as a community builder, and that, like you said, community is the most important element of psychedelic work and the integration, accountability. What does the community look like for you? How does your community form? How do you meet? Like, just kind of talk to us about the community in the UK.
Yeah, so the community that we're in, it's amazing. They consist of a lot of coaches, therapists, mentors, a lot of people in the space of self-development and all kinds of different areas, NLP, also spiritual teachers, guides, all kinds of people. And what I would like to lead in this community, in the way that I lead, is that we all have different views, different understanding of the world and how we make sense. And that's okay. So as long as we agree to disagree and we have our differences, we can have these incredible open conversations, although it triggers sometimes some people, but we still stay together. So that's kind of like the pillar of an authentic community where everybody has a voice and their differences are accepted, but we still have these conversations that might challenge each other. So that's where I see the growth. So no rescue culture here. We don't want to rescue each other. When somebody comes in and shares something really challenging about something, instead of making it about the others and the external problems and challenges, we say, what is your role in perpetuating this? So let's take a little bit of that ownership. Let's take that accountability. So there is an accountability. It's very strong. That we're not afraid of calling out each other, but also still stay together, still connected, because there is a sense of trust. So this is kind of like gives the idea and the vibe of what is community for me.
Beautiful. Sounds very similar to what we're working to create or are creating, and differentiating from kind of some of these other models that you've described in the rescue culture. Here in the States, that's, I feel like it's pretty prevalent. I don't know. In the UK, is the whole like spiritual avoidance? Is that
indirectly? Still, I think it's a pandemic of the world. This is a real pandemic, honestly. I think it's a global problem, but obviously, as a culture and as you know, UK are more reserved, so they do this indirectly, but it's still very prevalent as well. So yeah.
Americans are more outspoken about their spiritual bypassing. Oh, wow. What a great conversation. It has flown by here. The time has. So that tells me we are definitely due for another conversation down the road. Before we part, though, would you please tell our listeners, what is it that psilocybin says to you, Susan?
Yeah. So the psilocybin says to me that the template that we carry is not ours, it's learned. And there is a greater wisdom that connects everyone, that we need to find that. And that's going to come through a conscious work, or like a collective work together. Because for me, psilocybin is all about the community, the kinship, the togetherness. That's the agenda, because that's what saves the planet and the people. That's when we end all the problems and the sickness and the pain and the suffering of people. For me, it's all about get yourself in check with the template that you carry, that which is not yours, and you're meant to become aware of it. And these are the kind of conversations that I hear all the time. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, I definitely feel the connection, and I certainly appreciate your wisdom, as I'm sure our listeners and your community do as well. So thank you so much for what you're doing. It's sorely needed in the psychedelic community.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's been a pleasure to meet you, to have these conversations. It's a gift. So thank you for all the work that you're doing together with Courtney. Really appreciate it. Thank you.